Today I'm going to show you how I decorated this ramen cake. Come join me. So this cake is for my son's 22nd birthday. It says 21st and then that's crossed off because last year I wanted to make this cake, but I was sick and in the hospital. So now I'm making up for it this year and I thought it'd be funny to include that. So I started off the decorations by making the ingredients that will go on top of this cake. What I'm making right now are scallions. So I'm really just rolled out some green fondant and then adhered it at the sides and then left it dry like this so that it was better to be able to cut. We'll come back to that. This thing that I'm working on right now is a pea pod. So I'm making the shell of some peas, and now I am making some little balls to make some peas that will go inside of the pod. So I'm going to put them in, add a little bit of water so they stick, and I'm just adding 5 peas to this pod and then I'll close it. Then I'm using my fondant tool to make individual pockets where each of the peas will be. Just kind of making it so that you can feel them from the outside. I used a little bit of water and used it to seal my pea pod. And now I'm just trimming it up so that it looks a little bit more natural. Now I am moving on to working on creating some shrimp. I'm going to make 3, but I'm only going to show 1 in this video, at least me shaping it. So I'm just kind of shaping this into the shape of a shrimp. Then I'm using one of my fondant tools to pull back on that tail to make it look sprayed out like a shrimp tail looks. And then I'm just going to continue to shape that. I'm using this tool to make the separated portions or segments of a shrimp. And I'm going to use like a dark bronze, brown, maroon color. I'm not sure what color it is really. And I'm going to paint those lines that separate each of the segments. As I mentioned, I'm doing 3. I'm just brushing the excess powdered sugar off of those so that I can paint them and it will stick nicely. Here I'm adding some water to that color of paint that I was creating. Again, I'm just drawing on the lines of each of those segments. And after I get finished with this part, I'm going to mix up another color. It'll be more of a red-orange color, and I will paint my shrimp that color. So it looks like they are cooked. I'm mixing that orange-red color. And I'm painting those shrimp as I mentioned. Now I am just using that paintbrush to pull that brown color through a bit so it's not as bright. As I mentioned earlier, I was letting my scallions dry, and so now I'm coming back to those, and I'm using a pair of cooking scissors, and I'm just kind of cutting around that tool so that the scallions don't crush together, so they maintain that round image that you see when you see scallions. Now I'm moving on to making the pork pieces that will go into the ramen on top. So I use like a grayish brown color for my pork, and I'm just kind of cutting it out into a shape that might look like a pork shape. I referenced some pictures online to see what they were shaped like, and this is just kind of a general shape that I used. And then after I got the first one done, I traced that and cut out 3 additional. I'm pushing on the edges here to make them so that they're not ragged edges, so they're more smooth. And after I was finished that, I mixed up some brown paint and I painted along the edges where might be the outside of the pork that is browns as it's cooking. And then I'm going to use the same color, but I'm going to add some more water, which I did right there. And I'm making it lighter to paint the rest of this a brown color. To make it so it's not as gray looking, because no one wants gray pork. And after I was finished with that, I went back to those edges. I had added some red and a darker brown just to make that look more cooked. Maybe a bit of charcoal color to make more natural, I suppose. So then after I was finished with the pork, I moved on to creating some half eggs. So here I am shaping the first of the 2 that I will put onto the cake. And then I'm using the ball tool and I'm just kind of putting an indentation where the yolk will rest and continuing to move on with shaping that. I did think that this was a bit too tall, so I went back and I cut some of the height off of this particular half of egg. And I'm redoing that ball tool to put where my yolk will be. So now I mixed up some yellow fondant and I'm making a flat circle, and I'm going to add some water to where that space is where I indicated I would put the yolk, and putting some water there so that it sticks well into our egg white. And now that that's done, I'm moving on to doing the fish cakes that are often on ramen. And I used a round cookie cutter that has ridges on it that is similar to the fish cakes that you see in miso ramen. And then I cut these thin red strips of fondant and I'm going to put those kind of wrapped around those fish cakes. And then once that's done, I believe I will have all of the toppings completed for this cake. And I did these maybe a day or 2 in advance to give them some time to rest and be firm enough to be used on the cake. And with that, that completes all of my toppings, and this is what they look like together. And now we're going forward to putting the cake together. So I'm using a kit for an anti-gravity cake. So I use the bottom portion of that to draw with an edible marker where that center post will go through my cake board. So after I drew that on, I used a knife, I used scissors to cut out the circle where it would go. So then I assembled it. There are several clear pieces that connect together, and then they attach underneath with a piece that secures it into place. It's like a screw-on piece, as you can see me putting on right there. All right, so now it's time to put this together. I took some of the white or clear pieces off so that it wasn't as high, so it'd be easier to work with. So that cake did not go into where the next piece will connect of those clear pipe pieces. I put a piece of saran wrap in there to prevent cake from going into that as I set it down over top of that centerpiece. So once I pulled the cake out, I also pulled the saran wrap in and put the next layer of pipe in so that I can then add the next layer of cake. So I'm just putting a bit of buttercream icing in between each of these layers. This is going to be a 2-layer cake, and it's 8-inch. Here I am just flattening the top of this cake so that it rests flat like a bowl of ramen would do. So again, I'm putting that saran wrap into the pipe so that the cake doesn't go into that. And I'm just kind of feeling underneath, pushing it down a bit so I can see where the pipe will land, and then using a knife to cut out the cake from the section where that pipe will go through. And then I'm pushing it back down over top of it. And there we go. We have the cake now on top of the pipe or the center piece. I'm pulling that saran wrap out, and I'm going to go forward with covering this cake. So after getting the icing on the cake, I'm using a scraper or a spatula to smooth it out. Make it pretty smooth. It doesn't have to be perfect at this point because we're going to do some carving of the cake to make it shaped like a bowl. So I'm going to cut kind of in the bottom of that so it's more looking rounded. And here I am cutting those pieces from the bottom of that cake so we can get more of a bowl type shape. And then I'm going to go forward again, and I'm going to cover this cake the rest of the way. First putting that crumb coat on to block those crumbs that are now around the cake into the cake so that it's not filled with crumbs. And now that I have that crumb coat done, I'm going back and I'm adding that top layer, final layer of icing. And I'm going to smooth that out really well at this point. So now I'm beginning to work on assembling the pieces. So I'm using some tape, and I am taping these chopsticks so that they are in the position that I want them to be. And once I get them into the position that I want them to be, I'm not sure if I do it right after this, but eventually I will then attach them to the hooked piece of that center pipe that allows it to kind of go over top of the cake. So again, I'm using this tape to position the chopsticks so that they're held to be open as if they were holding on to some noodles. So this here I am using, I couldn't find my ribbon cutter, so I'm kind of eyeballing this, which isn't ideal, but it is what it is. So I am cutting some strips so that I can make some lines around my bowl. So I'm going to do a center line with red, and then I'm going to do a top and a bottom line with blue, just to decorate the bowl a bit. And here is that center red line. And you'll notice that the top isn't super smooth because that ultimately is going to be covered with noodles of fondant, and then also those pieces that I made, the other ingredients. Now moving on to doing the blue lines. And again, I will eyeball this to cut out the line. You'll notice I'm using the line on my workspace to guide my lines a bit. And then I'm cutting that and just joining those ends together. Now I'm working on the last of the lines, and this one's going to go along the bottom of the bowl. And now I'm just kind of cleaning up the top so there's none of that white icing peeking up over top of the blue line of fondant that I put in place. Here I am now attaching those chopsticks to the top portion of that center pole or and now that's been put in place. So now we're kind of ready for the anti-gravity portion. You can see it's kind of setting, hanging over top of the cake. So now I'm using an extruder to make some noodles out of fondant, and this is probably the part that took the longest. I'm not a big fan of using the extruder, but this is much, much better than having to roll out this many noodles by hand. So I'm thankful that I have it. So here you see me kind of putting these noodles over top of the top bent piece. I'm trying to cover that tape, cover the connectors, but you'll notice that they're clear still, and I was really struggling to get those covered. So in just a few seconds here, I will go back. I'm going to take all of these noodles off. I'm going to put them on the bowl part of the cake, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to wrap some of those clear pieces so that they're easier to cover. It was quite difficult to try to make it so that I could not see that clear piece. And after I wrapped those clear pieces in fondant, it was much, much easier. So here I am still trying to cover the clear pieces, not very successfully. And it was at this point that I was realizing that it was not covering very well. So now here I'm rolling out some pieces of that same colored fondant, and I'm going to wrap these clear pieces so that it's easier to see, or it's not as easy to see that center piece holding the anti-gravity up from this cake. You'll notice on the cake, the clear piece is no longer there, and all of those noodles are now on top of the cake. And I'm using some water to help hold those pieces of fondant into place. Now I'm back and I'm adding, you can see now that you can't see that clear piece that the noodles are on. So I'm continuing to just use the extruder. I did have some help from my husband to do this because it was starting to hurt my hands. But you'll see him kind of over on the left-hand side of the screen as I'm just collecting the noodles that he is running through the extruder. Here I'm just kind of placing them to hide some of the imperfections, like the places where the lines, the blue and red lines joined. I have noodles kind of hanging down to cover that up a little bit. And I'm just working really hard to cover that center piece, even though it is much, much easier now that the clear pieces have been covered with fondant. And here my husband is doing it, and I'm just collecting the pieces he's running through the extruder. And with that, I think we have the noodles in place. And now I'm just putting all of those pieces that I had made at the beginning of this video onto the cake. I did end up using only 3 of the pieces of pork because I made a lot of elements and I wanted to make sure that we had a diverse set of elements on the cake. And here I'm just arranging them to make them look the way that I want them to look, and just about finished with this. And last thing to do is to write happy birthday. So as I mentioned, I'm writing happy 21st and 22nd. So I'm writing the 21st and I'm putting 22nd right beside it. Birthday. And then I'm going to use some red icing and I'm going to cross off that 21st. And this is for his 22nd birthday, since I missed his cake last year because I was in the hospital, and I was devastated that I was not able to celebrate his 21st birthday with him. And there we are, crossing that 21st off. And with that, we have this cake finished, and this is what it looks like. So we're going to give it a few spins so you can look at it at different angles. I am super happy with this cake and how it turned out. This is the first gravity cake that I've done, and I really appreciate folks that stayed to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, I encourage you to like, comment, share, and also subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss any content that comes up in the future as I'm on this self-learning decorator journey. Thank you again for watching.